Dear friends, I too want to extend my welcome to all those who are part of our wonderful Discovering Judaism program. At the end of a week when we have witnessed yet again anti-Semitism in its worst form in this country, you make the most powerful statement of all. Even so, I wish to be part and support this people, and we are so grateful to you. Many of us, I and my colleagues, have the privilege of working with you month in and month out as you make this journey. I do want to acknowledge Rabbi Sarah Sepedin, who oversees our Discovering Judaism program. I'm so grateful to her. It was also she who organized this commemoration of Reproductive Rights Shabbat, who brought our wonderful guests back to us. And that commemoration will actually continue at the end of our service when Rabbi Ehrlich will join our two guests in conversation. So we hope many of you will be a part of that as well. So much has unfolded in this country since this time last year. A year ago, we marked Reproductive Rights Shabbat virtually. Omicron had forced our observance to be online only. After Rabbi Linda Henry Goodman addressed us remotely, though no less powerfully, we promised we would welcome her back and Andrea Salwin-Coppell too in person this year so that we could celebrate together under the auspices of the National Council of Jewish Women, the triumphant 50th anniversary of Roe v. Wade. But then came the Dobbs decision, and our gathering tonight is not one of the celebration we had envisioned, but it is nonetheless one of hope and one of determination to continue the struggle to ensure women's health and abortion access are protected in this country. These are rights deeply rooted in Jewish values and in Jewish law. So Rabbi Goodman is back to lift us and inspire us to action once again. She is, as you've heard, no stranger to Temple Emanu-El. During her final year at the Hebrew Union College, she served here as rabbinic intern, and then upon her ordination in 1985, became the first woman to be our rabbi. She would go on to serve a congregation in West Hempstead, direct the Hillel at Adelphi University, and teach on the faculty of Molloy College and the New York Theological Seminary. Then, in 1992, she was called to the pulpit of the historic Union Temple in Brooklyn, which some of you know very well, where she led with devotion for 26 years until her retirement in 2018 when she became Rabbi Emerita. In 2012, Rabbi Goodman was the first woman elected president of the New York Board of Rabbis. Rabbi Goodman is a senior rabbinic fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. She holds a Master of Arts in Hebrew Literature, a Doctor of Ministry degree, and an honorary Doctor of Divinity degree, all from the Hebrew Union College. Her bona fides in the arena of social justice are well established. She has long championed reproductive choice and healthcare access for women in New York State and throughout the country, having served on the Clergy Advisory Board of Concerned Clergy for Choice in Albany and the National Board of the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. Dr. Goodman was last with us just a couple of months ago to celebrate the installation of Rabbi Sarah Reines, and it is a great personal honor to welcome her back, Rabbi Dr. Linda Henry Goodman.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Davidson, and all of you. I'm so honored and delighted to be here. As I've said before, Temple Emanu-El always has been a source of deep inspiration to me in so many ways, and in fact served as the impetus for me to seek the rabbinate as my life's work. I will always be profoundly grateful for that, and so much more. Last year, on a very snowy Reproductive Shabbat, when we were still on our guard against Omicron, when Rabbi Davidson was kind enough to invite me back for this year, as he said, it was in reasonable anticipation that we would celebrate together the 50th anniversary of Roe v. Wade. Nevertheless, I also suspect that in our heart of hearts, many of us felt the winds shifting and acknowledged the all too real possibility that the Supreme Court actually would step over the edge to overturn Roe v. Wade. Despite the testimony of the 3 Trump-appointed justices who, while under oath, had characterized Roe v. Wade as settled law. Just a brief review, if I may. As you know, the actual date on which Roe v. Wade was handed down in 1973 was January 22nd. But the NCJW, along with WRJ, Women of Reform Judaism, and others, have looked to this Shabbat as Shabbat, Reproductive Justice Shabbat, for a particularly Jewish reason. This is Shabbat Parashat Mishpatim, statutes. The Torah portion contains what is known as the Covenant Code. You remember that in last week's Torah portion, Yitro, we read the so-called Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments. But unlike the concise, more universal ideals that are expressed in that code, the Covenant Code of Mishpatim this week takes us more deeply into the woods of how lofty ideals might translate into the daily interactions in society. And the specific section of the Covenant Code that is most relevant to us on Reproductive Shabbat is found in the following verses, which are concerned with how to determine appropriate retribution for injuries inflicted by one person upon another. When 2 or more parties fight, and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact, the payment to be based on reckoning. But if other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for life. And the passage continues, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. This section is familiar to all of us as lex talionis, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But rather than a literal practice, this really was a formula for computing payment for damages. The only exception was this: if a pregnant woman is pushed and she suffers a miscarriage, the one responsible is fined, and the one who determines the fine is the woman's husband. But if other damage ensues, namely, if she dies, if the woman dies, then the penalty shall be nefesh tachat nefesh, life for life. It is clear that the fetus that was within that woman is not categorized as a nefesh, a person, and the penalty is not the same as if a living person had been killed. And thus, this passage in Mishpatim, the covenant code of Exodus, became the foundational statement of the Jewish discussion surrounding abortion. And that is why the NCJW designated this Shabbat as Repro Shabbat. In our conversation downstairs after the service this evening, together we will look at just a few rabbinic texts that developed this Jewish discussion. But just so that I say it here as well, please, within the wide-ranging Jewish discussion, the bottom line for Jews is that life begins at birth, when the head is out and it's breathing on its own. Then it ceases to be a fetus and becomes a living human being, when the head is out and it's breathing on its own. More downstairs. For now, I'd like to speak to you both as a rabbi and a fellow New Yorker. And for those of you who might be here from out of state, well, I hope and assume that this recitation will still be of interest to you in terms of the specifics within your own states. Without a doubt, we here in New York are extremely fortunate to live in a so-called blue state. More than most others, New York State is committed to abortion access, birth control, and reproductive choice. But before we congratulate ourselves too much, I'm going to throw a little cold water on our celebration, and I hope you'll forgive me. Because blue state or not, all has not exactly been smooth sailing here, and we dare not lull ourselves into too much confidence. On this Repro Shabbat, since we are not celebrating the 50th anniversary of Roe v. Wade, I thought it might be helpful for me to relate to you anecdotally a few of the interactions that I have experienced in what now has been almost 40 years in the rabbinate, because I, along with so many other devoted, determined colleagues in the clergy, have been in this fight all that time, and clearly it continues. It's a long time to have to fight. Now, I'm not sure this is news to you, but we here in New York City and environs sometimes tend to be a little chauvinistic about our wonderful city and what I will characterize as a deep blue environment. But that is not at all the case in many cities and towns upstate, both north and west, and even out in eastern Long Island. My colleagues and I have learned that in spades over the years, as we have walked the halls of the Capitol in Albany, visiting with many of the assembly members and senators that sit in the New York State Legislature to make our case for the whole range of reproductive choice and women's health issues. Here is one that astonishingly, after all these years of talking, is still an active issue. Mandated, comprehensive, age-appropriate, medically accurate sex education in New York State public schools. As we all know, we Jews always have been notoriously committed to the value of education. Education is power. Knowledge is power. Don't we owe it to our kids to prepare them in this area above all? It may interest you to know that well over 25 years ago, in 1996, the governor of New York, as you may remember, was George Pataki, a Republican and a Catholic, who, I assure you, received regular direct pressure from the Archdiocese on anything that even hinted at reproductive choice, or birth control, or sex education, that even mentioned any of these things. But actually, Governor Pataki was genuinely interested in trying to implement some sort of statewide sex ed program in public schools throughout the state. So he charged his chief counsel at the time, whose name was Michael Finnegan, with putting together a rather diverse committee, educators and representatives of various religious communities, to try to figure this thing out. And because of my work at the time with the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, I had the privilege of being asked to serve on that committee, people from all over the state. As I recall, we used to meet over dinner at the Capitol on Monday evenings to try to arrive at some sort of consensus. The consistent sticking point was so-called all options teaching. The church, along with various others, was firmly committed to blocking this type of education and insisted on an abstinence-only curriculum, omitting critical information and values clarification study that would be included in an all options approach. Because if you don't mention sex, no kid nor any unmarried person would ever even think of having it. I don't mean to mock anyone else, but on this particular issue, I just think that that position is not helpful. These were tough discussions, and unfortunately, ultimately, they did not lead to any compromise that was agreeable to all the parties. What did begin to happen was that different school districts around the state met on an ad hoc basis to try to hammer out similar programs. But it wasn't universal. I said I should also mention that I live in Garden City, Long Island, just over the border of Queens in Nassau County. And for many years, the state senator from our district, a Republican, was one of the most powerful members of the Senate and chair of the Senate Health Committee. So year after year, proposals for statewide sex education programs never saw the light of day because he wouldn't allow them out of committee for a floor vote. And now here we are in the year 2023. Over a quarter of a century after those Monday evenings in Albany. And we are still trying to put into place a state mandate for age-appropriate, medically accurate sex education in our public schools. This is the statement released just this year by Planned Parenthood Empire State Acts, PAPESA. And as Jews, for us, this has always been self-evident. As I said before, information is power. When young people have the tools they need to make healthy decisions about their bodies and their relationships, they have a brighter future. Comprehensive sexuality education has been shown to improve health outcomes and benefit our youth. PAPESA supports legislation that would require the inclusion of a comprehensive, medically accurate, culturally, age, and developmentally appropriate sexuality education in publicly funded K-12 schools statewide. Your ability to access this vital information should not be dependent upon your zip code. But here in our very blue, progressive state of New York, this is still not settled. But this is only one manifestation, one symptom, if you will, of a state legislature that was populated by many members from very conservative districts in northern and western New York State. A word, if I may, about Reformed Jewish Voice of New York State. And we all know the RAC. And if you don't know the RAC, I hope we'll all learn about it soon. The Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. It's the social justice brain trust of the Reform movement in Washington. At the RAC's consultation on conscience down in Washington in 2002, on the concluding day of the consultation, all the delegates from New York State got together in kind of a banquet hall for lunch. And it was at that luncheon, as I recall, that we voiced our collective acknowledgement that New York is such a big state, and that in fact there is an awful lot of territory outside of New York City that is very different from New York City. And thus it would behoove us to form a partner organization of the RAC that would focus solely on issues in our state and on the assembly members and senators who would be voting on these issues. And thus began Reformed Jewish Voice of New York State. Every year we would meet in Albany, and rabbis and lay leaders alike would visit assembly members and state senators, usually on issues having to do with reproductive choice, emergency contraception, sex education, and the like. There were other issues, of course, marriage equality, economic justice, housing access, and the like. I won't address that now. What I will tell you is that one of the most astonishing experiences that we would have every year was that a number of these legislators had no idea who we were, or for that matter, that there actually were religious people who were pro-choice. But after about 10 years of consistent, unified, determined lobbying, sitting in the offices of these legislators, and as the expression goes, getting in their faces. You better believe they learned about Reformed Jewish Voice, and eventually they all knew exactly who we were. So here's a graphic illustration of the power of those people we elect to govern our state. In 2013, former Governor Cuomo, and obviously Mr. Cuomo has had issues which I am not going to discuss now, but I must give him his due in his steadfast commitment to this issue. In 2013, Andrew Cuomo, as governor, introduced a 10-point piece of legislation called the Women's Equality Agenda. Real pay equity and damages for discrimination in the workplace, zero tolerance for sexual harassment, punishment for credit discrimination, punishing those who engage in human trafficking, ending family status discrimination, punishing landlord discrimination, banning discrimination against victims of domestic violence, stopping pregnancy discrimination. The reform movement is well documented and on record as being fully and outspokenly in support of all the points in this initiative out of our commitment to a just and equitable society and the protection of those who are vulnerable in the face of unfair and oppressive practices. And indeed, these 9 points looked as though they were headed for passage. But the 10th point was the sticking point, and that was the Reproductive Health Act. Because at the time, though the Assembly held a solid Democratic majority, the state Senate was in Republican hands, and they blocked it at every turn. Now, just to remind ourselves of what the Reproductive Health Act was. As you know, because New York is such a progressive state, abortion was legalized here in 1970, fully 3 years prior to the landmark Roe v. Wade decision. But because Roe essentially made all those laws unnecessary, New York left them sitting in the criminal code, making it a felony to perform late-term abortions. But what that meant was that if, God forbid, it ever happened that Roe v. Wade should be overturned, as unlikely as all of us thought that was, abortion laws would revert back to the states. And with this legislation from 1970 still sitting in the criminal code, the danger was that a doctor or a healthcare practitioner who performed or assisted in an abortion procedure theoretically could have been brought up on criminal charges. The Reproductive Health Act would remove abortions from the penal code and place them into the health code where they belonged, removing the danger of criminal liability for healthcare professionals. So what happened here in our blue state of New York? 2014, 2015, 2016, 17, 18, year after year, the Republican majority of the state Senate voted down this 10th article of the Women's Equality Agenda, the Reproductive Health Act. The Republicans who controlled the Senate refused to pass that bill. Then, in the blue wave of 2018, control of the New York State Senate shifted to the Democrats. And Andrea Stewart Cousins, a stalwart fighter for women's justice and reproductive choice, became the Democratic majority leader of the New York State Senate. And by the way, our own Senate seat out in Garden City also flipped to a Democrat. And 3 months later, on January 22nd, 2019, the anniversary of Roe v. Wade, my husband Steve and I stood there in that room in the Capitol, and then Governor Cuomo signed that bill not more than half an hour after it was passed. Behind him stood our current governor, Kathy Hochul, and they were joined by Sarah Weddington, now Alea HaShalom, of blessed memory, the lawyer who argued and won the original case of Roe v. Wade before the Supreme Court in 1973, 50 years ago. You know, for all of my career, I've been a pulpit rabbi, congregational rabbi. But as such, I've had to be pretty careful to comply with federal guidelines as to what clergy are permitted to say from the pulpit and what they're not. No doubt, all of your rabbis are exquisitely conscious of these guidelines, and as a matter of fact, I heard Rabbi Davidson speak on it several years ago at a sermon seminar of the New York Board of Rabbis, and of course, it was an extremely thoughtful presentation. As pulpit clergy, we are not only permitted, but encouraged to discuss public policy with our congregants, just as we've been doing now. We approach it out of our understanding of religious teaching and morality, and our responsibility to advocate for issues of social justice. In fact, we should expect our religious leaders to address issues of public urgency. What we are not permitted to do is to use the pulpit to direct congregants to vote either for or against specific candidates who are actively running for office in an upcoming election. People are certainly free to draw inferences from our words, but we need to be careful with our words. But from this selection of experiences that I've referenced, and of course among many more, the message is clear, and we've heard it repeatedly in recent years. Elections have consequences. And those consequences affect every single one of us and our families and the lives we aspire to lead in this country. So, as you have heard, these are some of the battles we've fought over so many years now as Reformed Jews and as members of the pro-choice community. But as you have also heard, some of these battles continue even today, particularly in light of the blow we were dealt by the Dobbs decision last summer. For those of us who've been doing this for a long time, and those who are just entering the fray, the well-being of our society is in our hands, and the responsibility is sacred.